And yet, the war ended not in a grand fleet battle, but in the cramped, burning corridors of a flagship. Captain Daniel Rourke of the Terran Free Navy had been there from the first day of fighting. He'd seen orbital cities reduced to molten slag, watched escape pods drift frozen in space when rescue never came, and lost more crewmates than he cared to count. But on this day, aboard the Earthy Imperial flagship Vrashon, he thought with a single focus: take the bridge, end the war. His Marines moved in disciplined silence, mag boots clanking faintly on scorched deck plating. The air was thin, tinged with ozone and burnt metal. Earthy defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew the battle was already lost. Their bladed weapons clashed against human combat knives in a zero-gravity melee, flashes of energy fire lighting the carnage. When the final guard fell, Rourke stepped over the bodies and into the bridge. There, towering at the central command dais, was the Imperial Regent himself, his ornate armor dented, ceremonial blade lowered in defeat. And beside him, bound at the wrists by ceremonial chains of silver, stood his daughter. She was striking in a way that was almost unnerving to human eyes, tall, lithe, her skin faintly luminescent under the flicker of failing consoles. Her hair, the pale silver white of Earthy royalty, tumbled over her shoulders like liquid light. Her slit-pupiled eyes were the color of burnished gold, but there was no fear in them, only defiance. The regent did not speak, but placed the chain in Rourke's hands without ceremony. It was an act steeped in Earthy tradition, a public acknowledgment that the victor now owned the most valuable thing he possessed. Later, in the Grand Coalition Hall, the formality was repeated for the benefit of cameras and diplomats. Rourke stood on the polished obsidian floor, rows of officers, senators, and dignitaries watching. This, intoned Admiral Chorus, his voice carrying in the cavernous chamber, is your prize, Captain Rourke, the Regent's own daughter, Lady Thalessa, given in accordance with the ancient codes of the Earthy. Yours to command by right of conquest. A ripple passed through the gathered crowd. Among many alien cultures, such rewards were honored traditions, symbols of status, honor, and power. The human delegation shifted uncomfortably, but they said nothing. Thalessa raised her chin. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of venom. I will serve you only because my people's defeat binds me to shame, human. Rourke's jaw tightened. He didn't look at the admiral, or the senators, or even the curious press drones hovering above. He looked only at her. Slowly, he stepped forward, the chain heavy in his grip. The air between them was taut with expectation. He reached for the clasp click. The chain slid away, clattering to the floor with a sound that cut through the chamber, like a blade through silk. You're not my property, Rourke said, his voice flat, unflinching. You're free. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the recording drone seemed to hover more still. The Admiral's eyes widened. But Admiral Chorus began, confusion breaking his ceremonial composure. Captain, the surrender terms. The rules say she's my reward, Rourke interrupted, still holding her gaze. I'm changing the rules. Thalessa did not move, but something flickered behind her golden eyes, a shift so subtle. It could have been a trick of the light. The audience murmured in disbelief. Alien delegates whispering translations into headsets. The Earthy observers in the gallery bristled, scandal written on their faces. For the first time since she had stepped into the hall, Thalessa's lips parted, but no words came. Her pride would not allow thanks, yet her mind reeled at the unprecedented act. She had been prepared for servitude, for the humiliation of being displayed as a spoil of war. Instead, this human had done something dangerous. He had shattered the ritual, undermined the very symbolism that the Earthy Empire had built its pride upon. Some coalition officers applauded his decision privately, but others whispered that he had thrown away a once-in-a-lifetime bargaining chip. Thalessa herself, free in name, found her position more complicated than Chains had ever been. The galaxy still believed she was the human's prize, only now without the visible proof of ownership. The Earthlings saw her as a captive who had been dishonorably released. The Coalition saw her as a living symbol of victory. She saw herself as neither. Her first impulse had been to flee the moment she was unbound. But flight into the unknown would leave her vulnerable, perhaps even hunted by her own people. Rourke, infuriatingly, made no demands that she stay yet, neither did he arrange for her return. He simply said, "You're welcome to travel with us until you decide where you want to be." That was how Thalessa found herself aboard the Ironclad Resolve, the Terran Free Navy vessel that Rourke commanded. The ship was nothing like the gilded halls of the Imperial Palace. Its decks were narrow, functional, built for efficiency, not display. The crew moved with brisk purpose, clad in utilitarian uniforms that carried no elaborate symbols of rank. Even the captain's quarters were Spartan compared to the smallest chamber in her former home. Most disorienting of all was the crew's attitude toward her. No one bowed. No one addressed her with the formal honorifics that had followed her since birth. Instead, they called her Ma'am, Miss, or simply Thalessa without even stumbling over the pronunciation. They did not avert their eyes in deference, nor did they stare at her like a curiosity. Humans were strange. They were loud in their laughter, quick in their anger, and utterly shameless in expressing either. They teased each other relentlessly, even their captain. They questioned orders not to defy them, but to understand them. Among the Earthlings, such behavior would have been considered insubordination. Among humans, it was apparently how trust was built. For the first few weeks, Rourke spoke to her rarely. When he did, it was never about her captivity or her past. He assigned her no duties, imposed no restrictions. She could wander the ship freely. This unsettled her far more than the chains had, because it forced her to confront the reality that she was free to choose, and choice came with consequences. Her confusion eventually boiled over. One evening in the mess hall, she approached him as he ate. The room was noisy with conversation, the smell of unfamiliar spices thick in the recycled air. "Why?" she asked, standing opposite him at the table. Rourke didn't look up immediately. "Why what? Why free me?" she pressed, her voice low but edged. "I was given to you by right of conquest. You had every reason, every right to keep me." He swallowed a mouthful of food before answering. "Because people aren't prizes." "That is your custom, perhaps," she countered. "But they Earthlings know that the victor's claim is absolute. To refuse such a gift is to insult the giver." Rourke finally met her gaze. "Then maybe your customs need changing." For a moment, neither of them moved. She held his stare, searching for some hint of mockery or ulterior motive. But his expression was steady, almost maddeningly calm. She felt heat rise in her chest, anger, confusion, something harder to name. The certainty of her upbringing clashed violently with the strange, stubborn logic of this human. She turned sharply, her armor-like composure intact, and walked out without another word. But the echo of his sentence followed her down the corridor. "Maybe your customs need changing." Time aboard the Ironclad Resolve passed in strange ways for Thalessa. Days blended into one another, not because of monotony, but because human life had a rhythm she wasn't used to, structured yet flexible, disciplined yet full of unpredictability. She began to observe more closely, trying to piece together what drove them. Humans were not the strongest species she had encountered, nor the fastest, nor the most enduring. They lacked the raw physical power of the Earthlings, the advanced biotechnology of the Syrinx, or the instinctive coordination of the Trilari. And yet, she had seen them win battles against all of those species. The more she watched, the more she noticed patterns. Humans fought not just for themselves, but for each other. They were willing to take risks for comrades without hesitation. When one crew member was injured during a maintenance accident, a dozen others immediately stepped in, patching hull plating, running life support checks, and delivering hot food to the medical bay without being asked. No one kept tally. Number. One demanded repayment. In Earthy society, favors were calculated like currency. Among humans, they seemed to be given freely. It was disorienting. Rourke, as always, was a puzzle. He was firm when giving orders, but he never used fear as a tool. He listened to his crew's concerns, sometimes changing plans based on their input, an act that would be seen as weakness among Earthy commanders. Even in the training bay, where he sparred with his soldiers, he treated victory not as dominance, but as a teaching moment. Eventually, she found herself drawn into these training sessions. At first, she joined to prove herself, to show that a Earthy noble was no delicate ornament. She had been trained since childhood in swordplay and close combat, and she moved with fluid precision. Yet Rourke's fighting style baffled her. It was messy, adaptive, and shockingly effective. Where she favored elegant strikes, he used blunt practicality. They fought often, neither yielding easily. He praised her victories without resentment, and offered suggestions after her losses without condescension. She began to respect him, not just as a warrior, but as someone who seemed immune to the arrogance power usually brought. Still, there was an unspoken tension between them. The galaxy believed she was still his prize, a rumor that neither of them addressed publicly. Thalessa knew the whispers were a quiet humiliation. Among the Earthy, to be seen as a human's concubine, whether true or not, was a stain that would never fade. One evening, while they shared the training bay alone, she broke the silence. Her breathing was heavy from their latest bout, her pulse still quick from the clash. "Do you not fear the gossip?" she asked suddenly. Rourke raised an eyebrow. "What gossip?" "That I remain at your side because you keep me for other purposes," she said, her tone sharp, though her cheeks felt uncomfortably warm. He smirked faintly. "Let them talk." "You do not care what they say?" She pressed, incredulous. "People will believe whatever makes their world make sense," he replied, wiping sweat from his brow with a towel. "Changing that is harder than winning a war." It wasn't bravado. His voice carried no defensiveness, only a weary acceptance. For the rest of the night, she thought about his words. Earthy society was built on the foundation of appearances. Reputation was a kind of armor. Humans seemed to think the opposite, that truth existed independently of what others said. It was freeing in a way. Over the following weeks, Thalessa began speaking more with the crew. She asked them questions, not as an interrogator, but as a student. She learned that many had left families behind, that some had fought in battles she'd only read about, and that a few had once been enemies themselves before joining the coalition. Slowly, she realized something uncomfortable. She had stopped thinking of herself as a Earthy among humans. Now, she was simply part of the crew, and yet, part of her still resisted. She had not forgotten the grandeur of the imperial palace, the certainty of her role there. Here, she was untethered, free to choose, but also free to fail. The first rumblings came in intercepted transmissions, border worlds reporting raids, outposts going silent. The warlords had rejected the regent's authority and were striking out in defiance. The coalition called them insurgents, but Thalessa knew their mentality well. These were wolves who smelled weakness and blood. When orders came from the ironclad resolve to intercept a small but dangerous fleet, Rourke wasted no time. The mission briefing was concise: disable the warlord's ships, capture or destroy them, and prevent the raids from escalating into full-scale war again. Thalassa sat in on the briefing, not because she had been invited, but because no one stopped her. She studied the tactical display, her sharp eyes picking out the Earthy ship signatures immediately. She recognized them. 2 of the captains had once visited the imperial court. They had dined at her father's table. She knew their faces, their strategies, their pride. When the meeting ended, she stayed behind. "You know who you're fighting," she said quietly. Rourke glanced at her. "Do you?" "Yes. They will see me as a traitor if I appear with you." "Then stay aboard during the fight," he replied simply, as though it were no burden. "It's safer." Something inside her recoiled at that. "And watch others decide the fate of my people without me?" She shook her head. "No, I will fight." Rourke studied her for a long moment. He didn't try to talk her out of it. "Then suit up. You'll be with Bravo Squad." When the battle came, it was a storm of metal and fire. The ironclad Resolve dropped from FTL into the middle of the T. Earthy formation, its railguns thundering and point defense lasers stitching the darkness. Boarding pods screamed across the void, slamming into enemy hulls with bone-shaking impact. Thalassa stood shoulder to shoulder with human Marines in the hangar before launch, her armor a hybrid of Earthy craftsmanship and human engineering. The humans gave her space, but she could feel their eyes on her, curious, measuring, perhaps even trusting. When the boarding pod connected with its target, the hatch blew open and they poured into the corridor beyond. Thalassa moved like a blade given flesh, her plasma sword igniting with a hiss. She cut down 2 Earthy warriors before they could raise their rifles. Her strikes clean and economical. The Marines fought beside her without hesitation. They didn't treat her as an outsider, they treated her as part of the line, the Earthy. Defenders faltered when they saw her among the humans. To them, this was worse than defeat, it was betrayal embodied. She heard one of them shout her name, his voice thick with disbelief. She answered with silence and steel. They reached the bridge faster than expected. The warlord captain, a towering brute with crimson war paint across his face, locked eyes with her. "Daughter of the Regent," he spat. "You would stand with them?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I stand where I choose." His roar was pure rage, and he charged. The fight was brutal, he was stronger, but she was faster. When the opening came, she drove her blade through his chest, the smell of scorched armor filling the air. Hours later, the battle was over. The insurgent ships were disabled or destroyed, survivors taken prisoner. The ironclad Resolve's hangar was alive with noise medics tending to the wounded, engineers checking boarding pods, Marines recounting the fight in bursts of laughter and grim nods. Rourke found her there, helmet under her arm, armor scorched and dented. "You fought well," he said, voice level but with the faintest trace of approval. "I fought for my own reasons," she replied, standing tall despite the ache in her muscles. "Good," he said. "That's how it should be." It wasn't praise, exactly. It was acknowledgement, recognition that her actions had been her choice, not a debt, not an obligation. She realized then that she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer the human's reward, nor a Earthy noble, playing the role of reluctant guest. The battle against the insurgent warlords didn't just stop the raids. It sent a shockwave through both the Coalition and the Earthy Empire. News feeds replayed the same combat footage again and again. Lady Thalassa, daughter of the Earthy Regent, fighting side by side with human Marines, cutting through her own people's warriors without hesitation. To the Earthy loyalists, it was unthinkable. To the warlords, it was infuriating. But to many across the galaxy, it was something else entirely, a symbol. For Thalassa, the days that followed were a strange blend of exhaustion and attention. She was summoned to coalition briefings, her opinion sought on Earthy military psychology and political fractures. Senators requested private audiences, journalists begged for interviews. And every time she declined, the rumors grew louder. The official recognition ceremony came 3 weeks after the victory. The Grand Coalition Hall was as crowded as the day she had been presented to Rourke, but the air was different now. Then, she had been a chained symbol of surrender. Today, she walked in wearing her combat armor polished to a mirror sheen, her sword at her hip. Rourke stood beside her at the front of the hall, both of them flanked by flags of the coalition member species. Admiral Koraz, the same man who had once placed her in Rourke's hands like a ceremonial trinket, stepped forward to address the assembly. 3 years ago, he began. Captain Rourke led the boarding action that brought an end to the war with the Earthy Empire. By the ancient terms of surrender, Lady Thalisa was given to him as a prize of victory. But instead of claiming her, he did something unprecedented. He freed her. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience, though most knew the story. By now, the Admiral continued, his tone shifting, and when the peace we fought for was threatened, she did not run, nor hide, nor plead neutrality. She fought alongside him and his crew, risking her life to defend the very coalition that had once been her enemy. He turned slightly, gesturing for her to step forward. Thalisa did not hesitate. Her boots clicked softly against the obsidian floor as she took her place at the podium. Her golden eyes scanned the crowd, humans, Earthy, and countless other species watching in silence. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. "I was no man's property," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "I am no one's prize. I was born a warrior of the Earthy people. That has not changed. But I stand here today as more than that." She let the words settle before continuing. "The war taught me that victory and defeat are not always what they seem. I learned that strength is not only in the arm that wields the blade, but in the choice of why that blade is drawn. And I learned this from humans, people I was raised to see as enemies, yet who treated me not as spoils, but as antilas. Equal." Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably at that. Others nodded. "I chose to fight beside them," she said. "Not because I was bound by oath or chain, but because it was my will. That choice is mine, and I will never let anyone take it from me again." When she stepped back, the applause was immediate, swelling into a roar that filled the chamber. The human delegation rose to their feet. A moment later, others followed hesitantly at first. Then, with conviction, Rourke met her eyes as she returned to her place beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. But she could read the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of his mouth. A rare, quiet acknowledgment. It was then she understood the full scope of what he had done months ago. By freeing her, he hadn't just spared her humiliation. He had challenged the very foundation of a custom older than most of the worlds in the room. And by choosing to fight alongside him, she had proven that the rules could change not by decree, but by example. The ceremony ended, and as the crowd dispersed, she walked out into the plaza beyond the hall. The sky was a pale gold in the late afternoon light, and the sound of 100 different languages filled the air. For the first time in her life, she felt no pull toward the palace she had once called home. The galaxy was wide, dangerous, and unpredictable, but now it was hers to walk freely. She glanced at Rourke, who had fallen into step beside her without a word. "So," she said, a faint smirk touching her lips, "where to next, Captain?" He didn't break stride. "Wherever we decide."